Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Welcome you from all over the globe. The most recent sign-ins, Denmark, Chile, Marbella, Russia. Previously, I saw Nigeria, the United States. So really a global audience for what is, I think, a very exciting session, our latest expert series session. Julian Stodd is our protagonist. He's both a friend and a thought leader in this space of teaching and learning. And so it's with great pleasure that I will personally spend the next 30 minutes or so conversing with him. Julian is unique by many measures, and you'll get to appreciate that in the next few minutes. Starting with his title, he's captain, so not CEO, not managing director, but captain of a boat he calls Sea Salt Learning, and is a deep thinker on many issues, but one that is particularly at heart to him is this matter of leadership and how it's changing in today's context, the social world. No, and so we're going to talk a little bit with Julian about what's different about today's world, what therefore is different about the leaders and what they do in that world, and finally, ultimately, what is different in terms of the way we need to develop the capabilities and competence of these leaders. So Julian, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be here.
So let's start at the biggest and highest level, right? You speak about a context that you label as the social age, all right? Many out there are talking about the digital age. What's different in your definition in terms of the social age relative to this more broader digital explanation?
Well, it's a good place to start. I normally say we're substantially through the digital age. But to be clear, I don't say that because we've not yet felt the full effects of it. We've barely started to feel the true impacts of technology in terms of automation, in terms of enablement and facilitation, in terms of disruption, actually. But the reason I contextualize my own work in the social age is because I think we've already seen two of the key transformative effects. And the first of those is connectivity. So historically, we existed in social structures and formal structures that were owned by organizations, by governments, were formal, were based around infrastructure, which was owned by the system. And our connections happened within those spaces. But today, we're connected in many different ways, almost all of which are entirely outside the oversight, control, or consequence of any formal entity. Because we're connected in so many ways, we're able to maintain multiple personas in multiple different communities. And my own research and that of others is already showing these are the primary spaces that people turn in order to be effective. So connectivity is the first key transformative effect. And the second key effect is the democratization of just about everything, of storytelling, of communication, of creativity, of effect at scale. And I use that term really carefully because most of the organizations that we exist in are mechanisms of collectivism and effect at scale. They bring together people from different disciplines, different domains that can do different things, and they achieve an effect at scale, and they build a codified strength to do that. But today, we are increasingly able to be effective outside of any system because of this democratization of technology. So perhaps to put some nuance around it, I might say we are still in the digital age, but we are absolutely in the social age, because the thing that really counts is your ability, enabled by that technology, to come together, to think together, to make sense of things together, to take action together, and to be effective. So for me, I contextualize my work around leadership, learning, culture, change, all of it within the notion of the social age and the new skills that we need to be effective in that space.
Mm-hmm. So this connectivity and democratization, in a way, is the result of digital. If we intend digital as a kind of fabric that is permeating society, and in that sense, it's allowing these connections. And as a result of these connections, of course, data, and as a result of these connections and data, interactions. So bring it down to earth a little bit for us, right? The social leader is doing what exactly every day, different from your sort of bog standard leader. No, I mean, these opportunities for different interactions. What are they really, and can you make it tangible?
Well, if we look at the most simple definition of it, formal leadership, so leadership as we talk about it in many organizations today, is about power that is given to you by the system. So it's power that sits within a hierarchy, and it allows you to invoke formal consequence. It allows you to be effective within the system. Social leadership is power that exists outside the system. It's a reputation-based authority, which is granted to you by the community. It's contextual, it's consensual, it's highly fluid and dynamic, and it sits in a dynamic tension with formal leadership. In fact, you can look at the whole system this way. The formal system is the one that you own and can see and can control. It's the buildings, it's the employment contracts, it's all of the machinery and distribution networks. The social system are the bonds of trust, respect, and pride, the tribal structures, the modes of social organization that sit alongside it. And these two systems exist in a dynamic tension with each other. Formal systems are extremely good at conformity, at replicability at scale, and social systems are extremely good at questioning, at creativity, at innovation. And we kind of need both of them. Historically, we had formal leadership in formal systems, but today, I think we still need fantastic formal leadership in formal systems, but we need incredible social leadership in social systems. And to your question, what does it mean? Well, what it means is that I am effective, not just because of my formal power, but also because of my social power and authority that goes alongside it. In fact, when I ask people, most recently I surveyed in a military group in the US, how often are you effective purely through the exertion of your formal power? And they said, well, 96% of the time I'm effective through the permission and consensus of others. 4% of the time I'm effective because I tell people what to do. Now, of course, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Your formal position puts a parameter, it puts a frame around that social power. Hence why I say they exist in a dynamic tension.
Mm-hmm. And surely, though, this social dimension, as you stated earlier, has always existed, right? I mean, we've always been social beings, but it's about perhaps the opportunity of resolving that need in a fundamentally new way, no? And that's what I guess digital or technology or this era brings, is resolving that need in a new way. So you authored a workbook which I thought was pretty fascinating. Actually, I got it myself. The first 100 days, sort of on the job as a social leader, no? So could you give us some examples of how, you know, a social leader in the course of day-to-day life would resolve the social need in new ways and sort of move towards this kind of new expression of social leadership?
Absolutely. If you look at what's really changed in the system, in the wider world, there's a fundamental evolution of power. Formal systems are generally being depowered and eroded, and social systems are being empowered and amplified. In fact, when I just surveyed in one of the global tech companies recently, in a global population, looking at what people look for in leaders, they identified a population of 2,500 people, identified 69 different traits. And the number one trait they looked for was authentic storytelling, authenticity. And that's quite interesting, because authenticity is held in the action of the individual more than it's held in the action of the organization. So when I wrote the Social Leadership Handbook back in 2014 for the first edition, I was exploring this idea of social leadership. But what I wanted to do with the last book, my first 100 days, was, well, how do you build this out across 60,000 people? How do you build out social leadership capability at scale? And for me, leadership is always a journey. It's something which you have to experience, you have to learn, and you have to act in order to become that leader. So with the 100 Days book, I just sought to lay out a guided pathway for reflection. So it takes you through 100 days. It explores the aspects of social leadership that I've explored in the book. So that is about curating your space, choosing your space. You're given your formal title and your position in the hierarchy, but you can choose your social leadership space. You can choose your stance. We need to be expert storytellers to understand not just stories of consensus, but to be able to engage in stories of difference and dissent. We need to understand communities, sometimes to join communities, sometimes to grow communities, and of course, sometimes to leave a community that's adding no value. And ultimately, we have to understand how to build reputation, which gives us that social authority. And for me, really, the end point of this is being able to engage in complex collaboration. And this ties in with a stream of work I've been doing for around 5 years on innovation, disruption, and failure. And failure often happens, organizations often fail because they continue to act in known ways, in known spaces, in a world which is taking them into an unknown ecosystem facing unknown challenges. Complex collaboration means collaborating beyond the known, not just with people that you agree with, but with people who you fundamentally have a difference of opinion with. Mm-hmm. So the journey is structured like that. It gives people ideas to think about together and in groups. Every 10th day in that journey is an action day to go out and do something within your community to make a difference. Because ultimately, you know, social leadership isn't a theory, it's an action, it's how we are in the world. So that's the journey I attempt to take with that book.
That's fascinating. And most people, you know, when they hear this stuff, right, they recognize, you know, there's a behavioral component, clearly, right? I need to change my rituals, my routines, let's say. But they then get scared or somehow see as a roadblock the technological, let's say, know-how, right? You know, you'll hear things like, well, this is for the young kids, or, you know, this is, people don't engage in these tools, right? I mean, there is a basic digital competence from literally the use of tools that you need to acquire to actually do this effectively or not. What do you see there?
I mean, the interesting thing, so I'm an evidence-based practitioner, and with CSALT, I've set that up. We have a whole research arm that engages in creative, community-based research with 30 research partners around the world. And last year, I carried out 2 large-scale research projects, one on trust and one on communities. And both of these have explored aspects of technology. But here are some interesting things that come out of that. People trust the technology that's given to them by the organization, about 30% less than they trust social technology. So if I have a phone which is given to me by the organization, I know how to use it. If I have an identical phone which I own, I will use quantifiably different language. I will have a different expectation of consequence. I will believe I own the story I tell on that phone in a different way than the story that's told on the formal technology. 54% of people said they have low or no trust in the organization they work for. They'll continue to work there. These aren't bad people doing bad things. These are good people who understand that we exist in a new social contract between organization and individual. And here's one of the most interesting things. The largest group I worked with was in the National Health Service in the UK, exploring communities. Where do they turn to be effective every day? What are the technologies they use to collaborate every day? Now, the first group identified 17 different technologies they use on a daily basis to be effective. Of those, 16, so 16 of the 17, fell outside the control of the organisation. In fact, to be clear, they're expressly forbidden from using those 16 technologies to talk about about patient safety and patient data. One of the technologies was owned and controlled by the organisation. And the funny thing is, when I presented this data to an NHS group, I had a governance lead say to me, I strongly disagree with you advocating people using these technologies. And I said, I'm not advocating for them to use them. These are the technologies that people use. In fact, in that group, less than 1% of people said they needed help in how to use the technology. But over 60% said they wanted coaching and support to understand how to be effective in these spaces. And this is fascinating. When I've repeated that research in other groups, when I've done the research in military groups in the US, the number one technology they use to be effective is WhatsApp. Again, they're explicitly forbidden from using that technology. And the thing to understand is that people do these things not because they're bad, not because they're trying to break things. To your point, people have always been social. We're social creatures. We exist in trust-bonded tribal structures. The key difference in the context of the social age is we are now able to build our tribes to be global and to remain outside the consequence of the formal system. And this is an interesting thing. Broadly speaking, we experience two types of consequence. The first is social consequence. So if I say something very offensive to you now, you're professional, you're polite, you'll get us through the session, but you'll never talk to me again. However, if I say something illegal, if I incite racial hatred, I'll be sanctioned by the formal system. I could be prosecuted. The funny thing is that people describe social consequence as having something like 4 times more of an effect on them than formal consequence. We fear exclusion from the group far more than we fear sanction by the formal system. So this is the real challenge for us. How will we engage with authenticity in these spaces to take the organization forward? That's something I'm looking at in my next book I'm trying to finish over the summer, is exploring this idea. You know, how do we tie into this energy, this tribal energy, this dynamic energy of communities outside the formal system?
Absolutely, because if that's the case, you know, as your research is suggesting, this last point, I mean, a lot of questions came to my mind as you were talking, so I'll try to rapid fire some of them, but this last point of, you know, the let's say, implicit strength of social, we should see leaders jumping up and down in sort of celebration for the opportunities brought about by digitalization and the social era, and yet that's not necessarily the case. No, I don't know in your leadership development activity, but definitely in our own, you need to bring people to this realization. You need to encourage them to adopt new behaviors and routines, right? It's not necessarily natural or implicit, no? I don't know. What is your experience?
Well, I mean, there's 2 things, I guess. The first I'd say is that what we do in the social system is real. Organizations are substantially a fiction. We've made them up. We've spent the last 150 years building organizations and convincing ourselves that they are real and will last forever. But the evidence is against that. They were built in a time when replicability, consistency, scale, the principles of scientific management, Taylorism, the advent of modern HR and the rise of human capital, all of this was what we needed in a world that is now substantially gone. Today, what we need is organizations not just that are able to change, but which have a deep-seated, innate capability to change. So they don't change by expending effort, they change effortlessly. It almost certainly will take us down to new principles of organizational design. In my own work, I'm exploring that with the notion of a socially dynamic organization. It will be lightweight, it will be reconfigurable, and it will hold a diversified strength. And that notion of moving from codified strength to diversified strength, I think, is key. Formal organizations are good at building codified strength. That's the known strength to do a known thing in a known space, but they're fragile because of it. And you can see all around us, our healthcare systems, our finance systems, even, in fact, our systems of democracy and nationhood are all codified, fragile systems. A socially dynamic organization can gain the ability to change. It can unlock the individual agency of every person, and it can outcompete as a result. But here's the thing. There's a predictable pattern of failure in this. So 5 years ago, 7 years ago, I was sharing these ideas and people were interested, but nobody was doing anything about it. Today, I find most good big organizations are trying to do something about it. And they get a certain way down the path. But there's one thing which is key. In the background of rebalanced power, to ultimately become socially dynamic, we have to relinquish some control. And that's where formal systems tend to get stuck. They unlock the power of people right up until the point where the power of those people threatens the established power, the pyramids of power of the organization, and then they snap back, they exert control. Most of the constraint we face sits within the existing structures of power that the current organization is built on. So ultimately, we'll have to find ways to dissolve that power and give people new spaces to invest themselves in. And that, for me, is the most significant and interesting challenge.
So we have 5 more minutes and maybe 2-3 questions in rapid fire, maybe a couple from the audience, which I invite to participate. Suzanne has one. We'll take it in a minute. So the first one is, very briefly, to this point, linking back to the conversation on technology, are you concerned by the debate around data and sort of the privacy related to that and so on and so forth, that even more recently has once again popped its head, and how this will hinder that kind of space that you're advocating for?
I'm not worried, largely because I believe that most of our old systems will ultimately be swept away by the new. So much of the conversation is about how old systems of regulation and privacy and control can be maintained in a new world which has substantially eroded them. I suspect what we're seeing is an underlying, fundamentally evolved sociology. So will old models of privacy and identity come back? No, they won't. But will we find mindful and fair ways to hold privacy and to hold fluid identity in the new world? We probably will. But I don't think it will come through the imposition of regulation. Yeah. In fact, I, as you know, I write every day and I evolve my ideas, but I have one stream of work I call my 1% work, which is the ideas where 99% of it is probably wrong. But in that stream of work, I'm looking at, well, what will likely be our new structures of power. I think the notion of nation is largely disappearing because we used to be bounded by geography and transport technology and communication technology, and all of that is gone now. We can be a citizen of Apple, we can be a citizen of Lego, we can be a citizen of multiple different spaces. Infrastructure is being provided beyond governments. It's going to be provided by Jeff Bezos or by Amazon or by Google. So our notion of citizenship is likely to change. Our notion of community has become liberated and global. So similarly, I expect our notions of privacy and control will change, and our notions of power will change underneath it. And we see plenty of examples of that through the Me Too movement, the Take a Knee movement, the Never Again movement. Claimed power in opposition to outdated formal systems.
So your vision is aspirational for most, and maybe even beyond that for some, right? But if I'm interested, let's talk first about the organization. I'm sitting in HR or maybe in IT, or maybe I'm the CEO. If I'm interested in this idea and this intentionality, what do I do? What is my first step other than calling Julian?
Well, I think the first thing I generally, so I work globally with some of the biggest organizations who want to do this. They want to adapt to get fit for the social age. Much of what we have to do, first of all, starts with ourselves and starts with creating an organization that is able to listen. So the first thing we can do is to work with our existing leaders, our execs and our first line leaders, to build their social leadership ability, their ability to hear weak voices in the system. Once we've done that, we have to think about the evolution of our formal structures. So the organization of the future, the socially dynamic organization, will not just have an HR system. It will also have, in parallel to that, a system which grows and builds communities, which develops high social capital, which is able to support communities to become socially dynamic. We'll have an IT system which is focused not on monolithic dinosaur technologies owned by the organization, but rather in building diverse ecosystems of technology, some of which is going to be owned and controlled by the community itself. So we can start with the individual. We can build an ability to listen, and then gradually we'll build what I'm calling seed communities, communities which are communities of dissent. They don't share a unified view of the future state. but they are cross-connected throughout the organisation. So we're able to hear the voices we need to hear, the unheard wisdom we need to access to become socially dynamic. I say I'm a practitioner. I'm not a theorist. You know, it's good to have ideas, but it's better to go out and make a difference. And to do that, we'll have to change our own mindset at the top of the organisation, and we'll have to build a broad and diversified capability throughout the organisation. And finally, we'll have to be prepared to undo some of the structures of power and control that have made our organisations great in the past, in order to build new structures of a far more fluid nature that will ensure it remains great in the future.
So in our last minute, I don't know, maybe a more sort of light-hearted question. Suzanne from the audience is asking, are there any social leaders that you look at and you say, wow, that's a good role model? I mean, I'm kind of inspired by some of the actions. I mean, you might do it the other way around. Are there any leaders that you think that's a bad sort of example? Don't follow that one.
Yeah, I'm very clear. When I talk about social leadership, I'm not talking about some fanciful, ideal type of leader. So I've met people who I've found have been fantastic social leaders, but anybody can be a social leader, even somebody bad doing bad things. That's the nature of a system. All I'm really describing is a type of power. And instead of being a power given to you by a system, it's a power given to you by a community. But if you're a racist, if you're homophobic, if you're have some dreadful views, you can still be a social leader. And inherently, that's why we have to understand this type of power, because only by understanding the rebalancing of power and the ways that power is gained can we engage with it and diffuse those types of power which we disagree with. But we can only really do that through engagement. You can't deny social authority because you don't give the power. It's given by another part of the community.
Well, Julian, it's always fascinating to talk to you. Unfortunately, our time today is up, but I always appreciate your sort of thoughtful, provocative, forward-looking, stretching concepts, and I also particularly appreciate today also the very tangible sort of first steps that an organization might consider doing, because as you rightly say, I mean, theory is great, conceptualization is wonderful, but rather than get stuck in academic land, we need to ground it in reality. That's what we try to do here at IESE, combine the concepts with the action, and that's certainly what you're doing there at Sea Salt. So congratulations to you and the team there, and it was a pleasure spending a half hour with you.
Thank you very much. Great talking today.
Thanks to all who joined. Our next session is with Ben Nelson, the founder of Minerva, a fascinating school in California that is attempting to become the next Ivy League for a fraction of the cost. So please join us in a few weeks' time. And for now, that's all from IESE. Bye-bye.